Hi, we're talking with Dr. Ian Cameron, who's a 2014 recipient of the College of Family Physicians of Canada's Lifetime Achievement Awards in Family Medicine Research. Thanks for meeting with me, Dr. Cameron. I recently read your biographical sketch for our awards booklet, where you write, "Playing the bagpipes has been a great paradoxical presence in my life and a metaphor for who I am." Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, bagpipes aren't universally accepted, as you know. And I was just looking at a BC cartoon the other day, in which in the first frame, there are two characters. One has a bagpipe and the other one is saying, "What's that?" And in the second frame, the guy with the bagpipe is saying, "This is a Scottish test for impaired driving." And so the other guy says, "How do you use it?" And he says, "Well, you just blow in here, and if you think it sounds good, you're drunk." So this is just one of 1,000 bad jokes, or maybe good jokes, about bagpipes. And so they represent the absolute bottom of rejection, and I've been totally rejected. I've been eared by a group of brownies when I was piping in a scout troop one time. They all went like this, you know, the ultimate in rejection. But on the other hand, if you're playing out on the point just as the sun is setting, it can be sublime. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those nice little things that is bookmarks for either end of the human experience.
So you've been involved also in teaching about the humanities and the relationship to medicine, and I wonder if you could explain a little bit the relationship between the humanities and family medicine.
Well, I think, you know, it goes back before the advent of my time in medicine. It goes back to family, and it goes back to conversations at the dinner table, I think. And dinner back then in Truro, where I grew up, was at lunchtime, and it was a fairly good dinner. And we all had an hour and a half or a bit more maybe to get there from school and back. And my mother had an old Annandale dictionary that her father had. And it was pretty raggedy, but any new word that came up, or if there was a question about a new word, Mom was there checking it out in the Annandale. And then later on, when it disintegrated, she got a brand new big Funkin' Wagnall. So dictionaries and word precision were always part of meals. And then she often would read us letters from her sister, who was on a farm in northeastern Alberta. And she had a tremendous command of the English language, and she had a wonderful way with words. So that was an early part of my, I think, interest in stories and in precision in language and so on. And then I shared a room with my older brother, who was 3 years older than I was, and he was a scholar from an early age. And so when the lights went out, he would tell me everything he'd been reading. And in 1 year or year and a half, he went right through all the kings and queens of England, starting with William the Conqueror. So I got the Plantagenets and the York and the Lancaster and the Tudor and the Stuarts and the Hanoverians and down to the Windsors, and that took a long time. And but he was a fascinating storyteller, and he had a great retentive memory. And he also told me about the epics, Beowulf, one in particular, and what do epics mean, and how important are they? And only certain countries have epics, and I later learned that the difference between a language and a dialect is an army. There's something to think about, isn't it? I mean, people who only have dialects don't have armies, and therefore dialects don't live. So it's a bit of a power thing too, and that goes right into the importance and the power behind words, behind the emotions that words can generate. And but the other important thing in medicine, I think, is the art of listening, and listening to people's stories. And that all, I think, had an impact on me. And I, early on in the 70s, I think I was listening and reading mostly in medicine. But then in the 80s, through the college, I began putting on workshops in lessons you can learn from literature.
Okay.
And during the course of that time, I read a lot of Canadian authors, starting in the East and moving west. And the big ones, Alistair MacLeod, of course, from the East. Alden Nowlin, a poet, was very influential on me. Jacques Ferrand, right from Quebec here. He graduated from Laval, practiced in Gaspé, later moved to just across the river from Montreal, and was a very potent figure. So he had a tremendous influence on me too in what I was trying to do in medicine at Dalhousie and in workshops across the country.
Okay. Tell me a bit more about some of those workshops. What form did they take and the topics? I guess you focused on some of these authors and...
Yeah. Well, let's take Ferrand, for example. He wrote folk tales, which are a combination of the magical and the commonplace. And what are you going to get as a life lesson out of that, for example? What would you think, you know? So he has a story called Cadu, and Cadu moves from the country to the city, abandons his name, and therefore becomes anonymous, rootless. He has no past, and without a past, do you have a future? And in medicine, we're trained to be deductive thinkers. We get a bunch of information and we reduce it down to a diagnosis, and then we try to further augment the diagnosis with lab tests and consultations and so on. But what Ferrand is doing is taking an individual who becomes rootless because he doesn't have a name and he doesn't have a past, and you can apply that to a community, or you can apply that to a region, or you can apply it to a province. And so he's speaking about Quebec. Okay. You know, if you forget your name, if you forget your past, you don't have a past, and do you have a future? And the same thing can apply to family medicine in many ways. So, I mean, these are, I think, are the important messages that can come out of these little tiny stories. There's another one called L'Ami Karim. Did I pronounce that right? As near as you can tell. Anyhow, she's a witch. And she is a way of explaining to little children who are, the mother gives birth at home, and in this room there's all this crying and noise going on, and what's that all about? And then all of a sudden the crying and noise stops, and here's this new little baby. Well, the way of explaining that to little children in the Gaspé was L'Ami Karim, who would fly in on her broom, and the midwife would beat her, and that's the noise that you're hearing. It's the midwife beating L'Ami Karim. And in her hurry to get out of the room, guess what? She leaves behind this wonderful little baby. So the story, and it's only a page long, is being told by the Nipper, and the little Nipper. And the little Nipper is the oldest child who's next door in the room being looked after by an aunt or something. And he's right at that end of the one-digit age. So he's 8 or 9, not quite 10. And because of his increasing knowledge and his experience, all of a sudden he realizes precisely what's going on in the next door room. And so he says, when his father arrives with the herring scales on his arms, and he looks down lovingly at this new little baby, and he stomps his feet in his rubber boots, the little Nipper says he's the one who L'Ami Karim should have been beating, because they've already got 5 or 6 kids. So he has reached this wonderful point, maybe not so wonderful, when he is transported by his experience and knowledge out of the innocence of childhood and into the next stage of development. And so Ferrand captures this beautiful little point, which is really, it's a hugely important point, and these are what stories can bring to us. Borges, the Argentinian writer, talks about the important dates in history, and they're not like the Battle of Bannockburn or the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. They're little things like what he observed was all of a sudden, in looking at Greek drama, they were all monologues, and all of a sudden there were two, which meant there was dialogue. Right. And this huge blossoming of what you can do when you have two people talking back and forth, or three or four or more. I mean, that's a huge point in history, and that comes out of a little story that Borges tells. People perhaps don't pay attention to these little kernels that are so important, and often they don't pay attention to the little kernels that patients are telling us, which is what Ian McWhinney and Wayne Weston and Judith Bell Brown have all been teaching us about patient-centered care. So that's all about stories, listening, and so that's where I'm coming from.
Right, okay. Do you have a story or two from your practice that...
Well, I began, after I were using these in workshops, let me just say something about Ferrand before I get into that, because he was multifaceted. He was a humorist and a dramatist, and he was used in the October crisis to negotiate with the FLQ when Laporte was kidnapped. And he also was a founding member of the Rhinoceros Party. And this was a spoof, if you will. And so part of their platform was revoking the law of gravity. Isn't that a nice play on words, you know? They were going to count the 1,000 islands to make sure that the Americans hadn't stole one or two, you know? And this is a preoccupation of Canadians put in a humorous thing. And I think they, at one point, were going to turn over the national debt to Visa to run, you know?
Very good.
Higher education, they were going to promote that by building taller schools. So these are all whimsical things, which actually, if you look at them hard enough, there always is a point that they're trying to make with it. And so I think in any good story, there is whimsy that sort of gets your attention, maybe.
Right.
And it can also help you defamiliarize a situation that you've been so accustomed to, that you get into a rut, and so you don't see certain nuances. And I think good storytellers are able to do that. They will defamiliarize a situation. So Alden Nowlin, for example, has a poem in which he is the patient, and when he was totally helpless, he was naked, and the nurses would come in and strip him naked and wash him down and so on. And then when he was able to drink consommé soup out of a cup, they would, wash him down underneath his Johnny shirt. And then when he was able to speak and stand, they would knock on the door and ask permission to come in to do whatever. And the poem was called Escape from Eden. And so Eden, here's the paradox. In Eden, you're naked and totally looked after, and right. Then you're not. And which one is important at what time in your life? And he wants autonomy, and we never, as doctors or nurses, we never ask, or we don't often ask where they're coming from, whether they want to be naked and totally looked after, or whether they want some respect, or whether it's a graduated thing. And so he puts all these into a very short poem, and it's wonderful. And speaking of poems, there's a poem on a withered branch, a crow alights, autumn, nightfall. And that's a little haiku by a Japanese poet called Basho. And in that little poem, which takes visual things and puts them into so many, 3 lines, so many syllables. So it's very orderly, and yet it has all the elements of death and dying. Mm-hmm. The withered branch, the crow or raven, is a messenger of death. Mm-hmm. And then you have autumn, which is leading up to winter, the death of things, and nightfall, closing down of the curtain. So you have these beautiful little things all put very succinctly. And so these are all messages that you can get from poems, which are symbolic ways of telling stories. and stories themselves. So I began to accumulate stories, and I think one of the very first ones that I wrote was called Calling the Boys Home. And I was young, I was maybe 27 or 8, wet behind the ears, thought I knew everything. You know how it goes. And I had this delightful elderly patient who told stories and pithy comments, and to me they were like fog on the river, they were kind of ethereal and interesting, but had no bearing on anything really. His wife was 10 years younger than he was. She had had rheumatic heart disease, had a valve go. This was back in the 70s. They were just beginning to do valve transplants, but she was not in good enough shape to try this sort of thing, so the surgeons weren't going to touch her. And she went into sort of chronic congestive heart failure. She was in the hospital, and in those days we didn't have as many tools as we do now. We did have digoxin and we did have diuretics, and so you'd tweak this and tweak that, and she would be okay. And I would do rounds, and he would phone me at 10:30 in my office, and he would say, "Should I call the boys home?" And I said, No, your wife was, just marginally better, and we tweaked a few things. And so that sort of telephone call came 2 or 3 or 4 times, and then finally the penny drops. He's trying to tell me something. So I say, "Yes, I think you should call the boys home." So this is 9:30 in the morning. He phones them. One lives in Toronto, one's in Hamilton. They're on noon flights to Fredericton. They meet with their mother in the afternoon, have a wonderful meeting with her, and she dies that night. So that was a huge lesson for me. And it also, I think, says something. Susan Sontag, about that time, had written her Illness as a Metaphor. And she talks about death as being an offensive, meaningless event in developed countries now. And that's what was happening there. We were sort of micromanaging her and giving her another day and another day. And whereas in his culture, there were signals that you gave when you said goodbye, it was time to go, or when someone visited you who was meaningful to your life. These were signals that you had permission to die, sort of, and we don't do those things anymore. But these are the things that you can pick up from stories, and by listening to your patients' stories and the way they operate. So that is the power of a story, and I mean that particular story probably has bearing on Bill 52 right here in the province, where they're agonizing over these physician-assisted deaths, and physicians perhaps don't need to be involved with them. Let the family explore their own culture and their own ways of doing things, and giving the person who is dying, permission to die. And so if you want to look at qualitative and quantitative measures to make these sorts of decisions on it, maybe you're looking in the wrong place. Maybe you should be looking at stories, and these are much more powerful. Stories have been around a long, long time, long before qualitative or quantitative scientific measures, and people have been using them to communicate and make these very points that we've just been making.
So what would you say to, I don't know how much research there has been done to sort of prove the value of the humanities, and there's often the quantitative on one side and the qualitative on the other, and sort of never the twain shall meet. What do you say to the people who...
I say what I just finished saying. I would just repeat that, I think, because the value is not an immediately measurable one, or something that could be recognized as an immediately measurable item. But let me tell you another quick story. I'm helping supervise a family medicine resident who's in Charlottetown, and she's doing a qualitative study on palliative care patients. And she wanted to put in a narrative medicine one all good things, but in fact, if you impose a narrative medicine agenda on a patient, that's a doctor-centered approach, isn't it? Even though you're using something good and so on. So we talked a bit about that and finally concluded that it would be much better to get the patients where they're coming from, a story that's important to them, an artistic endeavor that's important to them. And so she did this, and she came up with patients who knitted. And so all of a sudden, as the sock becomes an artistic endeavor that is the patient's endeavor. And then she can talk about how important these are in terms of warmth and in terms of color and in terms of her family, her grandchildren. And then she talks to someone else who is a quilter. And this is a huge artistic endeavor. And what does a person put into it? They put their story into a quilt. And this artistic expression becomes a story for where they're coming from. So I think these things are immensely powerful, and maybe you can't capture them. Igor Stravinsky said he didn't know about his music, he felt it.
Right.
You know, he couldn't quantitate it or turn it into a qualitative, well, I suppose he could, number of notes and so on, but he felt them. And so I think we're getting into a realm that's very difficult to measure, but that you can't dismiss that, I don't think, ever, because they are so important to the individual's family, to the small community, to the region, and so on. These values become hugely important, I think, and I think the problem is convincing politicians, lawyers, doctors, artistic people like cameramen, that these are important. Right. Yeah, I think the individuals know they are important. Yeah, certainly. And they're the ones that ultimately count. Right. So, yeah.
So you've also done some historical writing yourself.
Yes.
Tell me about some of that.
That's my research.
That's your research, exactly.
Well, I've got a little series that I'm working on Sir William Osler, Canadian born and bred, and sort of the poster child of medicine from Canada. And I did one on, he was a researcher. I mean, he was one of the first people who refused to do a treatment unless there was some tangible proof. And this, of course, has led to in particular, the qualitative research. So he was called down. He was not just a doctor. I had a veterinarian in my practice back in Halifax, and one day she looked at me and says, "You're just a single species doctor. You're just a single species doctor." I look after all sorts of species. Well, Osler was not just a single species doctor. He looked after cows, and because he taught at what became MacDonald, the veterinarian college up there. And he knew a lot about illnesses of cows. So he was called to Pictou County to look at this terrible affliction that was getting to the cows down there called the Pictou County cattle disease. And about that time, he was starting to become famous, and he was moving, so he didn't have a whole lot of time. And he did a little study. The locals, and this is listening to the locals or listening to the individual again, the locals felt the disease was due to ragweed, which was a weed that had been imported from Scotland in 1850. And so he did a test with ragweed, and he did a test with amniotic fluid, injecting it into cattle, injecting it into guinea pigs, and it only ran for 3 months. And the guinea pig and the injecting the fluid from the cow that had died didn't adversely affect either of the two subjects, and the cows that had been fed ragwort and barley or something, he slaughtered one of them, and there were no problems with the autopsy and so on. So he'd set this up, but he then said, and this was the beautiful thing about Osler, I'm in the dark. I don't have a clue what's going on here. But in order to solve this problem, you need a proper study that goes over at least a 2-year period, and then you'll find your thing. Well, of course, they were paying the farmers to kill their cattle or to put them in quarantine. So the farmers were moderately happy, and so there was never any attempt until 1904. This was 1885 when he gave his, and they finally set up a proper quarantine station study, and they found that it was in fact ragwort, and you needed to give it to them for about 6 months before they would get a hepatitis, and then they ultimately died of a fulminating cirrhosis. So it was a hepatotoxic substance in the ragwort. And in these little marginal farms in Nova Scotia, they would be getting everything at the end of the summer, early fall, and it would be hay with ragwort in it, and the cows had nothing else to eat, so guess what? They ate the ragwort, and a number of them died. So anyhow, I'm very interested in his scientific approach to things. And,
Sure.
And wonderment and humor as well.
Wonderment and humor.
Yeah.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you'd like to talk about in terms of your humanity?
Really covered things very nicely. I and other doctors who are teachers learn from not only from their patients, but they learn from their residents. And I had a case of a young lady who had well-controlled asthma, but she, some things happen and you get a bad asthma attack. And she went into hospital and had to be intubated, and then came out and was fine, but she wasn't fine, and she was in her office frequently, and she was in the emergency room frequently, and the diagnosis would change from acute asthma attack to anxiety to panic attacks. We had a respirologist see her. The respirologist tweaked her meds a bit and didn't find anything particularly wrong. We talked about a psychiatric consultation, and the patient said, "Can they help me breathe?" And then the resident, we weren't really getting the diagnosis here, then the resident said, "I want you," she's talking to the patient, "I want you to go home and I want you to write down exactly what happened to you or what has happened to you and bring it in tomorrow and we'll see." So she came back, and what had happened the night she went in with her acute asthma attack, which she hadn't told anybody, was that she was about to be intubated, and they gave her curare, which totally paralyzed her, and she was lying there paralyzed and couldn't breathe, and she could hear everything going on, and she couldn't breathe, and then eventually, well, it must have been within a relatively short period of time, someone came, and with the benefit of being wide awake, she was intubated, and then they got some midazolam or something in her, and she fell asleep. But every time she got a little bit wheezy, she relived it. So it was post-traumatic stress syndrome. And the resident twigged. Not everybody is verbal. Not everybody will tell you if you don't ask the right questions. But she could write it. And wasn't that a wonderful lesson to learn from a resident?
A lesson and a story
and a very nice outcome, because she was fine. She got pregnant the next year. Well, she was married and got pregnant the next year, delivered, and as near as I know, lived happily ever after.
Good stuff. Thank you very much for spending the time with us.
My pleasure.